앉지 그래요?
Why don't you sit down?
Why don't you sit down?
들어오세요.
Why don't you come in?
Why don't you come in?
담배를 끊는 게 어때요?
Why don't you give up smoking?
Why don't you give up smoking?
꽃을 보러 오는 게 어때요?
Why don't you come to see the flowers?
Why don't you come to see the flowers?
와서 보는 게 어때요?
Why don't you come over and see?
Why don't you come over and see?
당신은 왜 여자친구가 없나요?
Why don't you have girlfriend?
Why don't you have girlfriend?
빨리 가지 그래요.
Why don't you go quickly?
Why don't you go quickly?
좀 더 쾌활해지도록 노력하는 게 어때요?
Why don't you try to be more cheerful?
Why don't you try to be more cheerful?
다른 방법을 시도해 보는 게 어때요?
Why don't you try a different tack?
Why don't you try a different tack?
조용히 해요.
Why don't you be quiet?
Why don't you be quiet?
머리를 깎는 게 어때요?
Why don't you get a haircut?
Why don't you get a haircut?
저와 함께 가지 않으시겠어요?
Why don't you come with me?
Why don't you come with me?
왜 말을 안 해요?
Why don't you say it?
Why don't you say it?
대화에 참여하는 게 어때요?
Why don't you join in the conversation?
Why don't you join in the conversation?
저랑 춤추러 가지 않을래요?
Why don't you come dancing with me?
Why don't you come dancing with me?
톰에게 당신을 돕게 하는 게 어때요?
Why don't you get Tom to help you?
Why don't you get Tom to help you?
저랑 같이 있어 주시겠어요?
Why don't you stay with me?
Why don't you stay with me?
다른 사람들에게 물어보는 게 어때요?
Why don't you ask other people?
Why don't you ask other people?
레스토랑에 가는 게 어때요?
Why don't you go to a restaurant?
Why don't you go to a restaurant?
앉아서 숨 좀 쉬지 그래요?
Why don't you sit down and catch your breath?
Why don't you sit down and catch your breath?
이 빵을 먹는 게 어때요?
Why don't you eat this bread?
Why don't you eat this bread?
내일 저와 함께 가지 않을래요?
Why don't you come with me tomorrow?
Why don't you come with me tomorrow?
수업에 오지 그래요?
Why don't you come to class?
Why don't you come to class?
저랑 같이 노는 게 어때요?
Why don't you hang out with me?
Why don't you hang out with me?
우리 집에 오지 않을래요?
Why don't you come to my house?
Why don't you come to my house?
그걸 사용하는 게 어때요?
Why don't you use that?
Why don't you use that?
그걸 보는 게 어때요?
Why don't you watch that?
Why don't you watch that?
뛰지 그래요?
Why don't you run?
Why don't you run?
같이 가지 그래요?
Why don't you come along?
Why don't you come along?
당신도 그것을 구매해보는 게 어때요?
Why don't you try buying that too?
Why don't you try buying that too?
오늘 밤 저와 함께 술 마시러 가지 않을래요?
Why don't you go drinking with me tonight?
Why don't you go drinking with me tonight?
이쪽으로 오시지 그러세요?
Why don't you come over?
Why don't you come over?
왜 대답을 안 해요?
Why don't you respond?
Why don't you respond?
친구들과 함께 그곳에 가보는 게 어때요?
Why don't you try going there with your friends?
Why don't you try going there with your friends?